As discussed in video 10, space is created through the type of change known as formation. Formation begins with the establishment of a singular identity, then produces more of itself and less of the other by integrating matter into itself. For example, consider a tree, which begins with a singular identity, a seed. It then integrates soil into itself to express the ramifications of the seed in tangible reality, changing in a directional and formative way. In order to undergo formation, the tree must remain pure, or only incorporate soil that correctly expresses its identity. The symbolic meaning of purity has great implications which run as a common theme throughout the Bible. Because purity is associated with only integrating elements into oneself which are formative to an identity, it is associated with space and stability. Purity is expressed in the Old Testament through the elaboration of many laws, including dietary and sexual ones. On the other hand, impurity implies incorporating elements that remain foreign to the communal identity. By attempting to integrate elements that do not fit into an identity, the process of impurity leads to less of oneself and more of the other, which means that one will be transformed into what they are not. For example, if a human attempted to eat a rock, they would die. This is because a rock cannot be successfully integrated into the body of a human. Instead of forming the human into a greater version of themselves, which the integration of nutritious food would do, integration of a rock would transform a human life into its opposite. Flesh would turn to dust as the human's life turns into death. As discussed in previous sections, the body of the civilization eats human beings because it integrates humans into itself. Therefore, if a civilization accepted too many foreigners into its nation, this would transform the country into something it is not. In this case, the foreigner refers to language and cultural differences, not ethnicity or skin color. Another way to understand how purity is associated with space and impurity is associated with time is through laws regarding sexuality. For example, if a wife does not remain pure to her husband, then the identity of the child will be in question, and this lack of identity is analogous to the ambiguity of the floodwaters. The child does not belong to one family or to another family, but is ambiguously in between. Moreover, instead of undergoing formational change whereby the family becomes a greater version of itself, sexual impurity would bring about the end of the family by calling into question the identity of the children and the existence of the marital union between the spouses. It is for this reason that the perpetual virginity of Mary is stressed in the Gospels. It symbolically describes her complete dedication to God, and there is no question about the identity of the incarnate Jesus, whose being is brought forth unblemished and purely. Later in the New Testament, Jesus emphasizes purity of heart as the path to salvation. Christians are instructed to only integrate thoughts into their being which are formative to their identity. In Matthew's Gospel, Jesus says, "Do you not realize that everything that enters the mouth passes into the stomach and is expelled into the latrine? But things that come out of the mouth come from the heart, and they defile. For from the heart comes evil thoughts, murder, adultery, unchastity, theft, false witness, blasphemy. These are what defile a person. But to eat with unwashed hands does not defile." In this passage, Jesus emphasizes how internal purity has primacy over external purity. Although it is important to maintain good physical health by only ingesting food which is good for the body, it is even more important to maintain good spiritual health by only accepting thoughts which nourish the soul. This begins with the practice of guarding the heart, or watchfulness, whereby one pays careful attention to their thoughts, because human thoughts are the only way demons have access to corporal reality. If an individual entertains negative thoughts in their mind, and is not careful to distinguish between their thoughts, this form of impurity will lead them into sin and death, and it will transform them into their opposite, calling their identity into question. Therefore, in the ancient world, purity is associated with stability and impurity with transformation. Hence, the practice of impurity is one which leads to a flooding of land or going into exile. So exile and floods are not the arbitrary result of God's anger, but rather a coherent and logical effect of impurity, or attempting to integrate elements into oneself that do not fit one's identity. To understand this more fully, consider the words of Carl Jung. No tree, it is said, can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell. In this case, in order for a tree to grow further upwards, it must reach further down into the earth, integrating more soil into itself. In the context of consciousness, the realization of one's true self or identity is intimately linked to the knowledge of God. Because humans are made in the image of God, understanding our own identity means coming closer to God, who is the center and source of our being. But the more one comes to know God, or the higher their branches reach, the more one becomes simultaneously aware of their impurities, faults, sins, and imperfections, which are antithetical to their identity. In other words, as one begins to see the divine light, this light simultaneously makes visible all the darkness in one's being. Interestingly enough, this is why tortured souls are symbolically described as burning in hell, because the light of God's love exposes their sins, which is painfully unbearable. This is clearly described in John's Gospel, when Jesus says, "And this is the judgment. The light has come into the world, and the people love darkness rather than light because their works were evil. For everyone who does wicked things hates the light and does not come into the light, lest his works should be exposed. But whoever does what is true comes to the light, so that it may be clearly seen that his works have been carried out in God." Therefore, knowledge of the self and God is too painful to undertake unless one is properly purified, because the awareness of all one's faults would be too difficult to bear. Like the roots of a tree descending into the earth, the process of integration occurs when an individual ventures further into the depths of their own soul, taming their previously autonomous passions so that they can be properly integrated into a singular identity. In the same way that the integration of soil causes a tree to grow up, so too does the integration of one's own marginal aspects or unintegrated aspects allow them to become a more full version of who they truly are. This is the purpose of repentance, fasting, and asceticism. Ultimately, this is the process of theosis, or deification. It is the reason why creation exists. In the garden, God was fully perceptible to Adam and Eve. However, the effect of sin clouded the nous, or spiritually perceptive function of humanity. The nous is the eye of the soul. It is the aspect of consciousness known as awareness, and is that which directly grasps God. Therefore, as an individual puts to death their passions and sins, they gain a fuller understanding of God, their nous is slowly opened, and they begin to perceive God in all aspects of creation. As an individual conquers another level of hell, they ascend to another level of heaven. Each demon is defeated with the aid of its mirror angel or saint. This is often referred to as trampling death by death. By allowing our autonomous passions to die, by killing the demon in our soul with the love of divine light, our eternal death is trampled. The perfect example of this is Jesus Christ, who integrated all of reality into himself, destroying the sins of the world and even death itself. Because Jesus conquered hell, his descent downward is mirrored by his ascent upwards, and this victory over the passions of earth and death itself allowed him to assume his throne at the peak of heavens, as ruler of all of reality unto the ages of ages. This is why, from a spiritual perspective, knowledge of God does not come through the mind, which is only capable of engaging in speculative functions of logic and reason. Instead, the knowledge of God can only come through the nous, which is capable of grasping God directly. The process of opening the eye of the soul only happens through strict discipline, as the passions and demons in one's own being are conquered, so their marginal elements can be integrated into a singular identity. Moreover, the full knowledge of God is not properly found through mediums that do not involve putting one's passions to death slowly through prayer, repentance, fasting, and good deeds. Spiritual experiences can be induced chemically, and many false gurus claim a cheap, superficial way to obtain the full knowledge of God. However, this is only an illusion. To climb the mountain of the Lord is difficult, requiring great focus and discipline. Although there may be some room on the margins for chemically induced changes in consciousness, as is demonstrated by the use of alcohol, ultimately there is no shortcut to theosis. The true warrior for Christ must conquer the demons within oneself one by one, with vigilance and watchfulness, with humility and discipline. Fancy imagination and cheap spirituality boost the ego, enslaving one to their passions under the delusion that they are holy. Moving on to the next chapter. In the Bible, the domain of space is associated with pure, discrete identity. On the other hand, the domain of time is associated with spectrum or continuous identity. Although this might be difficult to understand, consider an example from mathematics. Consider the premise that numbers and reality are both fully continuous. Now, in order to travel from point 0 to point 1, one must first arrive at point 1/2. Zooming in on the number line, we now see the same picture again. In order to get from 0 to 1/2, you must first get to 1/4. Zooming in on the number line, we now see the same picture again. In order to get from 0 to 1/4, you must first get to 1/8. Inevitably, we see that in order to go from one point to another, one must first go halfway to that point. However, one must also go halfway to the halfway point. If reality is continuous, this process goes on forever, creating an infinite amount of ever smaller halfway points. This continuity of reality creates maximum instability because one is always stuck in halfway points between identities. Halfway points are akin to the floodwaters because they are a mathematical mixture of two identities, making them ambiguous. Hence, in order for an identity to transform one thing into another, it must go through a series of intermediary steps. The more intermediary steps there are, the more difficult the transformation is. Maximum instability between 0 and 1 is created by inserting infinitely many intermediaries, which disintegrates the border between identities and establishes a spectrum of continuity or fluidity. This is why the flood is symbolized by a rainbow, because a rainbow shows a spectrum of infinite colors, but no clear colors at all. Also, this is why the rainbow is used as a symbol of gender fluidity. On the other hand, maximum stability is achieved by removing all intermediate steps. In this case, there would be just 0 and 1, which are two distinct identities that clearly establish space, as there is a removal of all mixtures in between them. Interestingly enough, the space established by using only 0 and 1 is what allows you to watch this video right now, as it underlies all code. To deal with the issue of multiplicity, we read in Genesis, "Let there be an expanse between the waters. Let it separate water from water. Let the waters under heaven be gathered to one place, and let dry land appear." In this case, despite the infinite multiplicity and continuous nature of the waters, God is able to split the waters and create dry land, which symbolizes the stability created by holding opposites apart and creating discrete space. To understand this mathematically, consider the fact that 1/9 is equal to 0.1 repeating. Now multiply both numbers by 9, and you'll see that 9/9 is equal to 0.9 repeating. But we also know 9/9 is equal to 1. Therefore, 0.9 repeating is equal to 1. Although almost impossible to conceptualize, this mathematical truth provides profound insight into the metaphysical structure of reality and the relationship between space and time, or unity and multiplicity, or heaven and earth. This realization is the basis of calculus, which centers around the truth that there is a way for continuous identities to come into discrete categories. Ultimately, the ramifications of this theory have led to general relativity, which builds upon it by demonstrating how human consciousness is an integral part of reality. This is because the logos of something, its central point or identity, is an invisible or virtual point that can only be perceived through human consciousness. In other words, every whole number can be expressed as an infinite repeating 0.9. And it is only the divine illumination of the logos, the awareness of the nous, which allows man to directly grasp this as one. In the same way, every object which we perceive contains an infinite array of atoms, and it is only the divine illumination of the logos which allows us to perceive any unity at all. In this way, both mathematics and physics demonstrate what was written in the opening lines of Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth, because they emphatically prove that reality exists as a combination of heaven and earth, and that man is the mediator between these two realms. To understand the ramifications of this in the Bible, consider that the domain of time is ruled by chaos or the flood. In the flood, there is a continuous mixture of identity. The waves are like circles or cycles, and the fluidity makes them unstable and changing into their opposite. Psychologically, the flood means that humans have lost the ability to perceive 1 from 0.9 repeating, or to perceive any clear identity from the abyss of infinite atoms in which we reside. To understand this in an extreme way, it is as if the nous is clouded to such an extent that human consciousness is no longer illuminated by the logos, and therefore reality presents itself as the quantum field that it really is, without any identity or stability. Ultimately, it means that humans can no longer perceive any heaven within earth. Therefore, many Old Testament laws centered around holding opposites apart in a strict way. Confusing opposites or changing one opposite into another would be considered acts of summoning time, which were strictly forbidden in Mosaic law because they were considered catalysts of the flood. For example, in Leviticus we read, "Do not crossbreed your cattle with diverse species. Do not sow your field with a mixture of seeds. Do not wear clothing with a mixture of diverse fabrics." In this case, cattle are not to be crossbred, which would mix and confuse their identity. Fields are not supposed to contain a mixture of crops, which would make the identity of the field ambiguous, and the identity of clothing, like the identity of a person, is to be of one clear essence, not an ambiguous mixture. Therefore, these laws describe a way of being which is aimed at creating stability. This prevents hypocrisy, as an identity is true to itself. In ancient Israel, hybridization was generally forbidden because it symbolized a return to ambiguity and confusion. Hybridization is similar to one half. It is a mixture of two identities, but in itself has no clear singular identity. It begins a process that creates more and more intermediate states between species. This transforms space into an increasingly unstable and continuous medium, which is interpreted as the cause of the deluge. In our times, we see that the borders between the separate categories are coming undone. For example, consider a modern form of the law in Leviticus. Do not mix feces of genders together. Do not mix feces with living space. In this case, we have established a clear boundary between that which we are, our identity, and that which we are not, that which we expel, our feces. By expelling that which you are not, you are simultaneously affirm that which you are. Therefore, the expelling of feces is done in a gender-segregated way, which symbolically affirms that humans are not pieces of crap, and that they are one of two genders. Moreover, feces are to be hidden and removed from civilization. They represent that which we expel. However, in all major American cities, we can now find feces on the street and sidewalk where we walk. According to the Bible, the confusion of gender bathrooms and the increase in feces on the sidewalk is one and the same. In the ancient world, the appearance of hybrid monsters was therefore interpreted as a warning sign that the stability of space was being threatened by the influence of time. In Genesis, the deluge was preceded by the appearance of giants called Nephilim, who were the result of demons having intercourse with women. This is equivalent to artificial insemination or genetically engineered babies today. Ultimately, stability is obtained at the expense of completeness through the removal of ambiguous cases. This inevitably creates remainders which are symbols of time, which are exiled for the creation of space, but manifest again when summoning the flood. An example of this is feces.